Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we'll be going over Hinduism and the Self. That's the section of our book. Part 4, Section B, Hinduism and the Self. And we'll be going over Joel Kupperman's article, which starts on page 134. And then we will be going over the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which starts on page 140. And these are the exam questions. Exam 3, Part A, Question 2, which of the views on the self do you think presents the best argument? Why? Explain. So this is the beginning, the Hindu view of the self. And Part B, Question 6, explain the differences between Hindu and Buddhist views of the self. So in this video, we'll be going over the Hindu view. In the next video, I'll be going over the Buddhist view as well as David Hume, because Hume is so similar, his philosophy is so similar to Buddhism. So regarding this video, there's another preliminary remark I need to make, and that's Joel Kupperman's interpretation of Hinduism is in line with the medieval commentator Shankara. And Shankara's interpretation of the Hindu texts, the Upanishads in particular, is very similar to the Buddhist view that there is no eternal individual personal self. So that renders this exam question 6, explain the difference between Hindu and Buddhist views of the self. It makes that difficult because the interpretation of Hinduism presented here is not that different than the Buddhist view. And so having mentioned that, let me also mention that after Shankara came other commentators on the Vedic texts. The Vedas were the original texts of Hinduism, and then there were commentaries on them, and the Upanishads are based on the authority of the Vedas. So people who commented on these Vedic texts were Shankara in the 9th century Common Era, then Ramanuja, then Madhvacharya, and then Chaitanya in the 15th and early 16th centuries. And each one of them rejected Shankara's rejection of the idea of an eternal individual personal self. Chaitanya, the last commentator, piecing together what his predecessors said, came up with the slogan Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva, inconceivably simultaneously one and different. The Supreme Self is one with all other selves, which implies there are no separate selves, but at the same time different than all of those separate selves. And it's inconceivable how that could be the case. It's beyond the power of human conception. It might be beyond the power of conceptual thought in general. So that, I think, would have been and also I don't think most Hindus subscribe to the idea that there is no eternal individual personal self. I've met plenty of Hindus who definitely do believe in an eternal personal self, who has an eternal personal relationship with the Supreme Self, who is all of us individual selves, and yet somehow inconceivably separate. Okay, so with that in place, I'm going to get into Joel Kupperman's article, and I'm just going to read through parts that I've underlined, and I'll bring in some comments. But on page 134, over 4,000 years old and composed of numerous sects, Hinduism is the religion of the vast majority of the people of India. Hindus seek liberation from suffering by achieving union with the divine. Hinduism supports a caste system according to which all people are born into one of 4 social groups. From lower to higher, they are servants and unskilled laborers, merchants and farmers, rulers and warriors, and spiritual and intellectual leaders, the Brahmins. Each has its characteristic rules and customs. All right, so this is actually Stephen Kahn's introduction to Joel Kupperman's article. In this article, Joel Kupperman, professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, explains the central doctrine of Hindu metaphysics, the claim that Atman, the true self, is identical with Brahman, the single divine reality. Later, we shall explore the Hindu doctrine of karma and rebirth. Okay, so Atman equals Brahman. The two sides of Hindu philosophy, Atman and Brahman. Atman is the individual self, and as I've explained, there's different interpretations of it, and Brahman is the ground, the impersonal ground of being, the potential for all, the precognitive essence of things that cannot be subjectively experienced. So Atman is Brahman. The way that Joel Kupperman and Shankara interpret that is that Atman dissolves into Brahman. The individual sense of a personal being dissolves like a lump of salt dissolves into the ocean. Atman merges into Brahman rather than maintaining the eternality of these two sides of being. The Brahman is given precedence, and to give us a good idea of Atman and Brahman, I think it really helps to think of the wave-particle paradox of quantum mechanics. I know that some quantum physicists, including Erwin Schrödinger, who was the first to discover the wave nature of the atomic particles, he was a student of Vedanta philosophy, and he compared the particle wave paradox that he helped to discover to the Atman Brahman paradox of Hindu philosophy. And I'll just read here, this is from his book, What is Life, or this is included in What is Life? All right, so this was a book, and Mind and Matter. It's two of his books combined together. He wrote What is Life, trying to apply quantum mechanics to biology to discover the self-replicating biological mechanism, which later helped Francis Crick and James Watson discover DNA in 1953. So it was in that book, here's what he says about Atman and Brahman. From the early great Upanishads, the recognition Atman equals Brahman, the personal self equals the omnipresent, all-comprehending eternal self, was in Indian thought considered far from being blasphemous to represent the quintessence of deepest insight into the happenings of the world. The striving of all the scholars of Vedanta was, after having learnt to pronounce with their lips, really to assimilate in their minds this grandest of all thoughts. Okay, so David Bohm, another famous physicist of the 20th century, also commented on the parallels between quantum mechanics and the Atman-Brahman equation of the Upanishads. So particle wave paradox, I've talked about this before, it should be a fundamental lesson for philosophy classes. The two-slit experiment led to the establishment of quantum mechanics. Are atoms and the subatomic particles of which they're made, are they particles or are they waves? Do they travel like liquid waves, somehow a subtler form of wave, or are they little ball bearings? And the experiment was, well, we'll shoot electrons through two slits placed very close to each other in a wall, and then behind that another wall, a detector screen. If they're waves, they'll go through both slits as a wave, split into two new waves which will radiate out and interfere with each other, creating a ripple pattern. Dark and light bands where they amplify, dark bands where they cancel out. If they're particles, they'll line up in two lines right behind the two slits. When they shot the electrons, each electron was detected as an individual particle hit, but when they weren't watching which slit it went through, the particles lined up all over the back screen, not directly behind the two slits. And the pattern that emerged eventually after an hour or so was the same pattern that a wave would have created had it gone through all at once. Now that was really insane. This was quantum weirdness, they called it. So they said, well, let's look and see which slit it actually goes through. And they put an electron microscope to see which slit these electrons went through. Then suddenly they lined up directly behind the slits like little bullets. So the implication was when they're being observed, they behave like little particles. When they're not being observed, they behave like waves. But the kind of waves that they are not physical waves. They are mathematical waves of probability for where a particle might appear, were it to be observed. Now that kind of a wave of probabilities, it gives us a good idea of what is meant by the word Brahman. It's infinitely energetic and compressed with all possible forms, it would seem. And Atman is the individual And this is the issue. What does Atman mean? Is it just an illusion that needs to be dissolved into Brahman, or is it the eternal flip side of the waves of probability? Is an electron a particle or a wave? It's both. This is called complementarity. These are mutually exclusive but complementary perspectives of the same thing. It's an individual particle and it's a wave of probability. It's a particle if you observe it. It's a wave of probability if you don't. You can measure its effects afterwards, and they indicate that it had been behaving like a wave of probability. Is the self a personal particle of subjective awareness, or is it an impersonal merging with infinity? Well, the implication for Joel Kupperman and Shankara is that it's an illusion that needs to be dissolved, but you could also say, and other philosophers like Chaitanya have said, it's an eternal, subjective, personal point of consciousness that is also somehow inconceivably merged with the impersonal Brahman. All right, so that's what Atman and Brahman means, the infinite atom of personal consciousness or subjective awareness, and that's the infinitesimal subjective awareness, and then Brahman's the infinite potential, impersonal potential. At least that's how I'm interpreting it from the various things I've read. But continuing with Joel Kupperman, he says, the Upanishads written in India mainly in the 9th to 6th centuries BCE were and remain the core texts of Hinduism. Skipping down a little, the metaphysics of the Upanishads centers on a single, deceptively simple claim: Atman is Brahman. Atman, pronounced A-H-T-M-A-N, Atman, and Brahman are central to classical Hindu philosophy. Skipping down a little, the right kind of experience is claimed to provide evidence for the identification of Atman with Brahman. Let us begin with Brahman. The ancient religion of India worshipped many gods and goddesses. 3 gods were paramount: Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the preserved, I think he meant preserver; and Shiva, the destroyer. So Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the preserver; and Shiva, the destroyer. One needs to be mindful of the difference between Brahma, who is merely one god, and Brahman, who is everything. The gods and goddesses all are, if they are properly understood, aspects or persona of the single divine reality, Brahman. So this is subtly accommodating to popular religion. The gods and goddesses can continue to be worshipped, but those in the know will be mindful that they are all aspects of Brahman. Thus far, I have been presenting the outlines of a worldview without giving the reasons for it. The reasons for identifying all gods and goddesses with Brahman will emerge when we look at the source of the idea of Atman. I'm just reading a couple more sentences here. The link is that gods and goddesses, like human beings, have desires, aversions, and characteristic forms of behavior. In short, they have personalities. The central argument underlying the metaphysics of the Upanishads is that personality has only a superficial kind of reality. Okay. So this is a contentious point. When we get into the Brihadaranyaka there are verses that would indicate personality is an illusion, and yet there are other verses that would indicate personality is eternal. How can there be a self without a personality? That's a philosophical question that Joel Kupperman is going to address. He says, the best way of appreciating this view is to examine a persistent feature of human experience, the sense of self. All right, so we all can think inwardly. All right, what am I? Oh, yeah, I'm a self. You go to sleep, you wake up. Even if you're in a different room, you still have the sense of being the same self you were when you went to sleep. What most people, quite possibly in every culture, firmly believe is that each of us has a me that persists through a life and perhaps beyond, and that in some sense remains the same me throughout. So he's going to say personal concepts of who I am are temporary illusions, a superficial reality, that the true self is this impersonal core of being. And that is what Shankara indicates. But the problem with our exam question is that's really not very different than Buddhism. Buddhism also says there's no eternal individual personal self. Okay, so continuing with Joel Kupperman, right-hand column, page 135, we could look inside ourselves, that is, for something that looks like a me, tracking it then as a stable element in our experience. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume tried this experiment and came up empty. This led him, in Book 1 of his Treatise of Human Nature, to deny that any of us has a self, at least in the sense of a stable, unchanging element of our minds. More than 2,000 years earlier, Buddha, reacting against a philosophical tradition that provided the basis for what became known as Hinduism, tried the same experiment with the same results. So in the next video, I'll be going over Buddhism and Hume. Hume's point was, oh, you think you're the same self from one moment to the next? As an empiricist, he said, okay, every real idea has to be correlated to some sense impression. Which one of your sense impressions is continuous and unchanging throughout your whole life? Your sight, sounds, and touches and smells, and they're always changing. Even your own thoughts and memories are flickering past all the time. There's nothing that stays the same from one moment to the next. It's a bunch of unconnected sense impressions, and you superimpose upon this flux of sense impressions, this illusion of a continuous self. So says David Hume, so says Buddha. So how's that different than Shankara's interpretation of Hinduism? It's hard for me to say. What is this continuous self if it's not personal? And it just merges with Brahman. Okay, Brahman doesn't change. All right, that's okay. So maybe there's the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism, the atheistic form of Hinduism, where there's no personal God and no personal self, but there is an eternal, unchanging Brahman. Perhaps Buddhism doesn't go that far and just says all we do experience is a flux. When you recognize that, you drop the illusion of this hankering for continuity, and then but to my understanding, you merge into nirvana or some higher state, which seems a lot like Brahman. At any rate, I'm going to continue here. So here's a question that Joel Kupperman brings up about Hume. He says, others have criticized Hume by saying, if Hume looked for his self and failed to find it, what was doing the looking? All right. Oh, you were looking inside introspectively in search of yourself. Okay, you couldn't see it. That's funny, but who was doing that looking? Oh, you were looking for your glasses and you couldn't see them because you were wearing them and looking through your glasses. You know, you can't see your own eye. You can see reflections of it. I can see a video reflection of it, but I can look in the mirror and see but I couldn't see my own eye. The source of perception can't perceive itself. Seems to be the objection to Hume. So Joel Kupperman says, but maybe a self, if there is one, includes both elements, perhaps in a form of experience that is non-dual. If such be possible, it would be more successful. So rather than having this dualistic, I'm looking for myself, it implies a separation between the looker and that which is perceived. So maybe get rid of that dualistic presumption. So another alternative is that the self, rather than being an element of experience, is something posited in relation to all possible experience. This was the view of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. He held that the self, at least the self connected with experience, is a unifying feature of the structure of experience and not something that could be an item within the structure. So Joel Kupperman goes on to say the Upanishads offer an answer different from this one that does appeal to a special kind of experience. All right, but first let's talk about Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant said what Hume did, looking inward for some unchanging, simple, uncompounded self, Kant called that empirical apperception. Your perception is your five sense organs. Apperception is introspection. Empirical introspection is what do you actually perceive? If you close your eyes and think of your own thoughts, what thoughts are you experiencing? That's empirical apperception. Kant introduced another form of introspection he called it transcendental apperception, and you infer the existence of a unified self that furthermore unifies all of your unconnected sense impressions into solid objects that interact with each other according to steady rules, laws of nature. Through empirical apperception, you realize, oh, all I'm actually experiencing is this flux of phenomena, this innumerable stream of unconnected sense impressions, and then I'm foisting upon them relations of ideas that aren't inherent in them. I'm connecting them in fictitious ways through the habits of the human mind. Kant said, no, it's not some habit you developed. These are inborn a priori categories of thought, and they're all rooted in the ultimate self. This is which you can perceive through transcendental apperception. So let me read some of that. Okay, I don't want to lose. I've got another Katha Upanishad I want to look at here, but here is, okay, so this is metaphysics. This is from Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason, and he's talking about this original and transcendental condition is no other than transcendental apperception. Consciousness of self, according to the determinations of our state in inner perception, is merely empirical and always changing. No fixed and abiding self can present itself in this flux of inner appearances. Such consciousness is usually named inner sense or empirical apperception. What is necessarily to be represented as numerically identical cannot be thought as such through empirical data. Or to render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experience and makes experience itself possible. What's that condition that makes all experience possible? The self. There can be in us no modes of knowledge, no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another, without the unity of consciousness that precedes all data of intuitions of sense impressions, memories, and internal emotions. By relation to it, the self, representation of objects is alone possible. This pure, original, unchangeable consciousness I name transcendental apperception. That it deserves this name is clear from the fact that even the purest objective unity, namely that of the a priori concepts, space and time, is only possible through relation of the intuitions to such a unity of consciousness. The numerical unity of this apperception is thus the a priori ground of all concepts, just as the manifoldness of space and time is the a priori ground of the intuitions of sensibility. All right, so that's just a little bit to what Joel Kupperman was referring to, Kant's idea of a self. It's this unifying agency. So we read Kant earlier in the book about what is knowledge, what can a human being know, and he said, well, through empiricism, we can never know the thing in itself, because all of our empirical sense perceptions are organized for us unconsciously by these inborn categories of thought, space and time, as well as substance and causality. Those are the big ones. So space and time, those aren't out there. Those aren't physical things in the exterior world. They are the categories of human cognition, which forces our sense perceptions into an arena of space that endures through time. I'm looking for this. What is this? The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. He relates that insight to Hinduism. So this is from The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's first book, section 18. The great audacity and wisdom of Kant and Schopenhauer succeeded in winning the most difficult victory, the victory over the optimism which lies hidden in the essence of logic, the optimism which is also the substratum of our culture. He's talking about Western Socratic culture. While this optimism, founded firmly on the Aeternae Veritatis, the eternal truths, had believed that all the enigmas of the world could be known and fathomed, and had treated space, time, and causality as utterly absolute laws of the most universal validity, Kant revealed how all these only really serve to elevate the mere phenomenon, the work of Maya, to the status of the single and highest reality, and to put it in the place of the innermost and true essence of things, thereby making real knowledge of the latter, the innermost and true essence of things, impossible. That is, according to an expression of Schopenhauer's, lulling the dreamer into a deeper sleep. So Maya is the power of illusion that overcomes an Atman and forces it to identify itself with the body. But according to Joel Kupperman, there's only one Atman. And Atman is Brahman. There's only one self. There aren't many individual personal selves. And that one eternal self merges with Brahman like a lump of salt. So it does not seem to me that Joel Kupperman is acknowledging the existence of any self-aware, personal, supreme soul. whom the Hindus generally call Vishnu. So we remember that he talked about three gods were paramount in Hinduism: Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the preserver; and Shiva, the destroyer. Okay. Then there's different forms of theistic Hinduism, and the most popular form worships Vishnu as the supreme self. And they worship Shiva, but the Shaivites worship Shiva as the supreme self. And the worshippers of the mother goddess, Shakti, they say she's the supreme soul, and all the others are derivative souls. But the Vishnu worshipping branch of Hinduism is the more philosophically popular, and we'll be seeing that in the Bhagavad Gita with Krishna, who claims to be the supreme Vishnu. So that form of Hinduism does believe in an eternal, personal, self-aware, omnipresent soul of the universe, and that all subservient souls are eternal parts and parcels of the supreme soul, merged with, there's one supreme self, and the facets of that absolute personality are each of us. Something like that. That is a lot different. That's very different from Hinduism, from Buddhism, which says there is no self. But what Joel Kupperman is arguing here is it's much closer to Buddhism than that theistic form of Hinduism. And Maya, according to these Vishnu worshipping schools, there's two forms of Maya. There's Mahamaya, which makes you believe that the things you perceive through space and time, the material world, are real, and you identify with your physical body. But then there's what's known as a Yoga Maya, the Maya of union with the Supreme Self, where you have these illusions of personal interactions, but the illusions are eternal. So what's the difference between an eternal illusion and absolute truth? It would be hard to say. So it's a very philosophically complex religion, and Joel Kupperman, he mentions that later in this article. But let me just continue with his article. So he went past Kant, and he said the Upanishad, so Kant had his transcendental apperception, but on page 136, on the left-hand column, Joel Kupperman says the Upanishads offer an answer different from this one that does appeal to a special kind of experience, unlike Hume's introspection, which is empirical apperception, as Kant called Hume's introspection. This special kind of experience is not available to everyone. It requires extensive preparation and hard work, which is, Hume did a lot of hard work to get his form of introspection, and Kant did the same thing. But at any rate, it requires extensive preparation and hard work. Its features are more easily explained if we first become clear about what the Upanishads mean by Atman, and also how they are sure that it can be found if one searches for it in the proper way. All right, so what do the Upanishads mean by Atman? There's a lot of different interpretations of what the Upanishads mean by Atman, and Joel Kupperman is taking Shankara's interpretation as the standard. We've seen that there's a widespread assumption that each of us has a stable, persistent self. Can such a self change? Intuitively, it might seem that the answer is yes. You change over time, but you're still the same self. Well, how can you be the same self if you change over time? On the right-hand column, page 136, the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus is famous for the cryptic utterance, "You can't step in the same river twice." In much the same spirit, he might have argued that you can't be the same person today that you were yesterday. All right. So how can you be the same person today that you were yesterday? And what he'll go on to say is, well, you eliminate the things that change, such as your personality, and whatever's left that doesn't change, that's your true self. But getting rid of personality, which is a subjective point of view, how do you have an Atman anymore, which is this point of perspective? That's it's not so much Atman equals Brahman as that Atman is an illusion and there's only Brahman. It seems to be what they're really arguing here. So then he goes into this interesting a series of thought experiments about what is a self. How can you define a self? So the Oxford philosopher Derek Parfit, in his Reasons and Persons, has given a nice example of this. He imagines you are traveling to Mars by teletransporter. This process involves going to a room on Earth and pressing a green button. You lose consciousness, all your cells are destroyed on Earth, and at the same time you are reassembled on Mars. After you've made several trips in this way, there's one in which there's a malfunction. You regain consciousness on Earth, but now there's also you on Mars. All right. All of your cells are destroyed and recreated on Mars. Are you the same self? And then now the cells aren't destroyed on Earth. You're recreated on Mars. Are both of them the same self, or is one merely a Xerox copy of the other? Well, both that example assumes that the self is a byproduct of the material body, which is entirely against Hinduism. So I don't know how that really applies to this article on Hinduism and the self. And he uses the same presumption that, the self is rooted in the body in this next example. The best example of a problem case that might occur soon is this. Imagine a future transplant operation in which half of your brain is put in one body and the other half is put in another body. Are both of these people you? If the answer is yes, are both of them the same person? Again, he's identifying the self with the brain, with the body. But the theory of Atman is that it's a soul separate from the body. That's very clearly spelled out in the Upanishad that we're going to read in a moment, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So those are materialistic definitions of a self. And so it doesn't seem to be that pertinent to the question of Atman. What is Atman? Is it personal or is Atman impersonal? Brahman is impersonal. Is Atman or Brahman contains the potential for everything, personality, impersonality. It's beyond conceptual description. So I'm just pointing out that difficulty. On page 137, the right-hand column, he says, rather, we tend to assume that the me that persists through a lifetime has an identity that, as the 18th century philosopher Bishop Butler puts it, is simply you. I'm not a changing thing, I'm just me. Most contemporary philosophers, says Joel Kupperman, think that this is indefensible and more or less side with Hume. And that is the case, that most academics do not believe in an eternal individual self. They believe that, consciousness is a byproduct of material evolution. And he points out to David Hume again, so I'll skip that and continuing here. There is an alternative response, though. One might simply deny that the persistent me changes. Personality, the thoughts and feelings we have, and our physical appearances all change, but perhaps there is something underlying all of these things, some core of our being that does not change. Okay, so continuing at the bottom of the right-hand column, he says, there is one alternative remaining if we want to do justice to our intuitive sense of an unchanging me throughout life. This is to look for a core of self that has no elements of individual natures that grow and change. This would be a core that underlies and is separate from personality, thought patterns, bodily nature, and so forth. He says this is our only alternative, that the core of ourself is not personal, because personalities change. Well, there is another alternative which he doesn't mention, and that is that all of our personal idiosyncrasies and memories throughout life, although they appear to change and dissolve into nothingness, are actually eternally preserved at the horizon of the cosmos, which is what the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is going to tell us. It's also what holographic string theory tells us. It's what Plato told us. It's what the Upanishads say, also the Katha Upanishad. This idea of information conservation at the outermost sphere of the universe is the Upanishadic alternative to what Joel Kupperman is saying here, so that you can have an unchanging and eternal self, where the past, the present, and the future of your entire biography is unchanging and eternal. That is what people who have near-death experiences oftentimes recall. They say, my whole life flashed before my eyes. It was one continuous, preserved, conserved experience of a self. And that's what David Hume says you'd have to experience, some unchanging, for you to have an unchanging self, every memory you've ever had must be experienced simultaneously and incessantly. And that is what people say they experience when their consciousness rises above their body and accelerates toward the outermost border of the universe. The Katha Upanishad is a near-death experience of a Brahmin boy, Nachiketas, talking to the demigod of death, Yamaraj. Yamaraj says, oh yeah, Vishnu, he's out at this outermost sphere, the ether. That's the highest goal of life. So I bring that up because my personal focus is on the parallels between this ancient cosmology of the cosmic horizon and holographic string theory, which I talked a lot about in the previous videos. And I might read some from some of the other Upanishads, but I just want to continue here with Joel Kupperman's article. So he says, and I'll just read it again, there is one alternative remaining if we want to do justice to our intuitive sense of an unchanging me throughout life. This is to look for a core of self that has no elements of individual natures that grow and change. This would be a core that underlies and is separate from personality, thought patterns, bodily nature, and so forth. This is Atman. In the view of the Upanishads, this is what, at the deepest level, you are. What I am suggesting is that the Upanishads' view of Atman makes good philosophical sense if it is seen as the conclusion of the following largely implicit argument. So here's his premises, which will lead to a conclusion. Each of us has a persistent me. This me, as it intuitively seems, must be unchanging. But personality, thought patterns, and so on do change. Therefore, the persistent me cannot include such elements. So there is no eternal personal self, says Joel Kupperman. And I would beg to differ and say that there is an eternal individual personal self, which consists of the gravitational singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. And at the same, that would be Atman. And at the same time, there's Brahman, the waves of probability, in which everything is merged in an impersonal state, and that each of us is simultaneously an individual, personal, subjective point of everything, and an impersonal wave in the ocean of Brahman. And that psychological paradox is mirrored in the world of matter with the particle wave paradox revealed by quantum mechanics. We're little particular particles of personality, I would say, when we observe ourselves as such. That was the response to Hume. Oh, you looked inside yourself and you couldn't find yourself? That's funny. Who was doing the looking? And yet on the other side, inconceivably simultaneously, we are merged in this impersonal Brahman. That's an alternative interpretation to what Joel Kupperman is offering here, one that is takes a strong stand against the Anatman philosophy of Buddhism. What Joel Kupperman is arguing here is not that different from Buddhism. So I keep bringing that up because it's also pertinent to our exam question. And again, this is an introductory class, so I'm not expecting you to master all of the subtleties. If I can tell you've read the articles and you can bring in some pertinent quotes to defend your analysis of them, you'll do well on the exams. All right, so continuing here, left-hand column, page 138. The further conclusion is that your persistent me, lacking all elements of individuality, is the same as anyone else's persistent me. All right, so there is only one self. There might be apparent different personalities, but beneath them, they're all rooted in one self. That the theistic interpretation would agree with that. Yes, all individual personal selves are like the perspectives of one supreme self, but that supreme self is self-aware. It has a personality, and all the other personalities are fractal fragments of the absolute personality. Joel Kupperman is saying no personality, which sounds a lot like Anatman, no Atman to me, but I'm going to continue reading here. The Upanishads indeed assume something broader, that the inner nature of all things, and not merely of all conscious beings, will be the same. This yields an image of the universe as a field of inner realities that are all at bottom the same. So continuing a little, the name for this field of inner reality is Brahman. Atman then is Brahman in somewhat the way in which a drop of water is the ocean of which it is a part. Whether the identity of Atman and Brahman should be viewed straightforwardly as a matter of the same thing in two different guises, or as an identity between part and whole, becomes a debatable subject in Hindu philosophy. All right, so he admitted it. It is a very debatable subject, and he is clearly taking the atheistic interpretation, meaning no personal God. Oh yeah, do you believe in God? Yeah, I believe in a God. Does that God have any sense of self or knowledge of who you are or knowledge of what it is? No, it's impersonal. Is that, I mean, a rock is impersonal. A table is impersonal. Why would you call this impersonal thing God? It would seem to me personality lends an extra level of excellence to being, not detracting from it. And I think there's a big problem with the personality that identifies itself as a material body versus the personality that identifies itself with being an eternal Atman. And then how do you define Atman? So again, it is a debatable subject, as I've been proving by debating poor Joel Kupperman, whose article is just waiting for me to be read. So continuing, the philosophical implications of the claimed identity of Atman and Brahman are complicated. They include a philosophical monism. The entire universe is one thing, but they include also an account of what we are that is more complex and qualified than one might at first think. Now, that's the word qualified. So monism, non-dualism. There is no difference between you and anything else. Everything is just one thing. Atman is Brahman. Qualified non-dualism says, oh, yeah, but there actually is a difference between different Atmans, and that culminates, we went through Ramanuja, Madhava, and Chaitanya, with Chaitanya saying, and Madhava, and I believe Ramanuja as well, that we are all eternal individual selves. Although we are merged with the Supreme Self, we retain our eternal individual personalities who relate with the Supreme Soul Vishnu in another transcendental spiritual world. I think it should be interesting to note that according to this, and I see we're going to get into the concept of illusion, according to the theistic interpretation of Hinduism that worships Vishnu, the material world is a series of universes in a megaverse of parallel universes with Vishnu in the center of each one and Vishnu occupying each point of the outermost sphere, as we're going to see in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That cloud of individual universes, like a bubbling ocean, is just the dream of Vishnu. Vishnu, there's one Vishnu, but Vishnu has many forms. One form goes to sleep in this causal ocean and exhales from the pores of his skin all of the bubble universes. When Vishnu inhales, all those universes are returned to the body of Vishnu, who then goes back to the spiritual world, which consists of innumerable spiritual planets called Vishnu Lokas. Each form of Vishnu has his own planet, which he shares with the female counterpart, Lakshmi. Each Vishnu has a Lakshmi pair. They have different names, like Sita Ram, Radha Krishna. There's an infinite number of pairs of Vishnus and Lakshmis. And each of us belongs eternally on one of those planets, which is populated by an ecosystem of self-aware species. Even the grains, the particles of dust are self-aware, and each of them has an eternal relationship with the Supreme Vishnu, which includes a relationship with the Supreme Lakshmi. Those worlds are run by Yoga Maya, the eternal spiritual illusion of blissful personal interaction between separate personalities. It's called Maya because it overlooks the unity of all being, Brahman, because it's more relishable to have personal interactions. So that is this theistic, yes, we are all one, but at the same time there's these eternal individual souls that have eternal relationships with the Supreme Self. You can call it illusion if you want, but it's not the same as the illusion of identifying with the material body. It's this eternal illusion, Yoga Maya. So it's a very complex cosmology, but there are alternatives to what Joel Kupperman is saying. This is the only alternative left. There are many, many alternatives beyond what he's introducing us to. So this qualified non-dualism He's alluding to these, and we're only getting excerpts, so he very well might have mentioned them in his article. But continuing at the bottom of page 138, left-hand column, there is the sense, of course, in which, if the Upanishads are right, you never change. Brahman is always Brahman. But, on the other hand, there are obvious respects in which you do change, especially as you come to think of yourself as Brahman. There's also the problem of the layers of individual personality that surround the Atman. According to the Upanishads, they are not the real you, or any part of the real you. Are they then an illusion? He's saying yes, they are an illusion. Nevertheless, it is an illusion that has an experiential life of its own. One of the striking things about the progress to enlightenment, though, is that the experiential life of individual personality is more ample and noticeable at the beginning than it is toward the end. Ancient Hindu texts convey a sense that to be enlightened, or nearly enlightened, is to be highly impersonal in affect, manner, and self-presentation. When you have seen one enlightened person, you have seen them all. All right, so that's highly impersonal. An enlightened person is more or less merging into like a rock, this impersonal, impervious being. And there are descriptions of yogis entering these kinds of states, but then there's other highly personal, self-realized beings who go around dancing in ecstasies, singing about Vishnu. But as I said, Joel Kupperman's taking Shankara's interpretation and alluding briefly to the other subsequent interpretations of the Upanishads. So continuing here, it sometimes seems as if the Upanishads want to say two divergent things at the same time. One is that there is a sense in which to become enlightened, fully engrossed in the mode of thought that goes along with the claim that Atman is Brahman, is to become Brahman. Certainly the person on the way to enlightenment becomes more Brahmanish. Continuing a little bit, but the Upanishads clearly insist that such a person, like all of us, always was Brahman. Everything is Brahman. Along this line, there are clear statements that individual personality characteristics are parts of the reality that Brahman spins out of itself, creating the universe out of itself like a spider spinning a web. All right, so he's saying there seem to be trying to say two things at the same time. There's no individual self. It's just this impersonal Brahman. And yet, individual personality characteristics are part of Brahman. So, if our Atman is Brahman, then these personality characteristics are also Brahman. Are they equally Brahman? A recurrent metaphor is that each of us is like a drop of water in the ocean that is Brahman. Perhaps the individual personality characteristics could be compared to froth surrounding the drops of water. No, he will say, they are not equally Brahman. The personality characteristics are an inferior illusion, which he'll go on to call a superficial reality, as opposed to the ultimate reality, which is this impersonal, changeless Brahman. He mentions, although we're all one, Hinduism also has a caste distinctions. They take them very seriously. It's supposed to be based on how aware a soul is in that life of the identity of Atman and Brahman. The Brahmins, named after that which they study, are at the top, and each subsequent distinctions, the three modes of material nature, the gunas, goodness, passion, and ignorance, tattva guna, rajaguna, and tama guna. Everybody's gross and subtle bodies are made of these three modes of nature. That determines your caste. If you're mostly in the mode of goodness, you'll be a Brahmin. Mostly passion and goodness, Kshatriya. Mostly passion and ignorance, Vaishya, merchant. Mostly ignorance, Shudra, laborer. So that's, how can this philosophy that we're all one have such a rigid caste distinction? And so that's what he talks about, these two levels. Superficial reality of the embodied souls. Our embodied lives have laws of their own, and a whole story. Our false egos are nevertheless real things. They're real things happening based on a false identification of the self with the body. And that false identification of the self with the body, that's the basic human condition. It needs to be organized, and it should be organized with the people who don't make that false identification ruling things from the top. Okay, so continuing on the left-hand column of 139, here's an analogy that may be helpful. The scientist and philosopher Sir Arthur Eddington, in the introduction to his The Nature of the Physical World, remarks that the table in front of him is in a way two tables. It's a solid table, like this one I'm on here. On the other hand, according to quantum mechanics, it's mostly empty space, which you've got electrons orbiting protons and neutrons in the center, and it's 99% of that atom is empty space. And yet we experience something very solid. So there's two ways of looking at it. The one Kupperman calls the folk understanding of our everyday experience, and then the more scientific understanding would say, yeah, despite the fact that we can't put our big old clumsy hands through the table, doesn't mean that it's mostly empty space. Okay, I think a more helpful analogy would be the one Erwin Schrödinger, another scientist, put out about Atman and Brahman, similar to the particle wave nature of matter. You're an individual when you observe yourself as such. When you're not observing yourself as such, you merge into these waves of probability. I'm just thinking about, when you're not being aware of yourself, you get carried away on the waves of instinctual behavior, which are statistically predictable. And these waves are statistical waves for where particles might appear. But you know what? I've gone off enough tangents that I'm going to pull back from that one. All right, so continuing here, 139, the right-hand column. There are acceptable criteria within the framework of nuclear physics for judging that the table is largely empty space. There also were acceptable criteria for judging that it was solid and dense. So it looks highly plausible to hold that there genuinely can be two different sets of statements that provide a picture of something real. All right. But does he really think Atman is real? It doesn't seem so to me. So continuing on that right-hand column, what is thought of as the deepest truth is provided by the framework that is informed by Atman as Brahman. In this framework, there is only one reality, Brahman. Okay, so that's his interpretation. So Atman is not real. Individual subjective points of view are not real. Everything is Brahman and nothing ever changes. Let us call this framework ultimate reality. There's also a framework of superficial reality, which represents the view of anyone whose thinking has not been entirely engrossed by the idea that Atman is Brahman. I mean, to say Atman is Brahman, you could also say Brahman is Atman, in which case Atman is the only reality, but it's not saying that. He's chosen to interpret it that way. To say Atman is Brahman, I remember I went to college at Boston College, a Jesuit school, and a priest in a philosophy class said, God is you, but you are not God. So what does that mean? So it's similar to the way you are your hand, but your hand's not you. You could cut your hand off, but you're still you. God is the source of you, but you're not the source of God. So to say Atman is Brahman doesn't mean, Atman's fake and Brahman's real, that Atman is really actually just Brahman. That's the way Joel Kupperman is interpreting it. But another way you could interpret it is, you could interpret it the opposite. Brahman is just a manifestation of the supreme personal Atman. Or you could say, as Chaitanya says, it's inconceivably, simultaneously both. Atman is Brahman, Brahman is Atman. The particle and the wave, they're just mutually exclusive but complementary perspectives of the same thing. I think that's a more wholesome way of looking at it. And that was the conclusion of the evolution of Hindu philosophy after Shankara through Ramanuja, Madhava, and Chaitanya. Okay, so in this framework, the superficial reality, there are countless individuals, including humans, animals, plants, pieces of furniture, gods and goddesses. Each of these things has its own characteristics. There is change, including processes of creation, preservation, destruction, life and death, spiritual fulfillment, spiritual sloth, and outright sin. All right, so at any rate, he says individuality, the idea of individual personalities, is superficial reality. It's temporary and it's not eternal. That is Shankara's interpretation of the Upanishads, but not the theistic version of Hinduism, which is more popular than the atheistic version that we were just reading from Joel Kupperman. So now we're moving to the Upanishads themselves. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, this is translated by Eknath Eshwaran, 1987. So I'll read a little bit of his introductory remarks on page 140. Brihadaranyaka means of the great forest, and that is an apt name for this Upanishad. which is by far the longest and one of the most revered of these magnificent documents. Okay, so the opening selection, all right, so it is Yajnavalkya is how I've heard it pronounced. It's spelled Yajnavalkya, but I've heard it pronounced Yajnavalkya. So that's how I'm going to say it. If I'm mispronouncing it, then in your minds, correct my mispronunciation. But this is Shankara, this is what Eknath is saying. He said, what Yajnavalkya wants to teach us is the greatest discovery of the Upanishads, the self, which is identical in all of us, the life of all that lives. Whenever we love, he tells his wife, we are really responding to the self within that person. Therefore, and this is the underlying theme of all mysticism, if we discover the self in our own consciousness, there will be no more parting, no more sorrow ever. Shankara once declared that the two worlds from the Upanishads give us the essence of these two words from the Upanishads, give us the essence of all their teachings. Meditate on the self. That is, become one with, realize this underlying reality. So it begins with Yajnavalkya, this Brahmin. He's saying to his wife, Maitreyi, that he's going to leave family life and enter into the meditative phase of life after the married life, which is part of the Hindu tradition. You're married and then you renounce the family life. Then the next stage is what's called sannyas, where you really renounce everything and you become a traveling teacher of the Atman and Brahman philosophy. So he's saying, okay, Maitreyi, it's time for me to go. I got to split up my wealth between you and my other wife, Katyayani. So that's how it starts. She asks, well, will money teach me about, give me immortality? No, it won't. And they get into a conversation. And then the next conversation is between Yajnavalkya and King Janaka, who brings 1,000 cows with 10 pieces of gold between each of their horns. And he says, whichever of you assembled pundits, you Brahmins, is the best, can argue the best, you can take all of these cows, all this wealth. Yajnavalkya says, I want those cows, I'll take the challenge. And then he explains this idea of the Akshara, the string that has all of the information, past, present, and future, out at the horizon of the cosmos, which is one of my favorite parts of this. And then in the end, finally, there's a story of Prajapati, the demigod who created all the other demigods, except for Brahma, teaching the demigods and the demons and the humans. And he says one syllable, da, and each of them interprets that word to mean something which compensates for their overt ways of behaving. And then Prajapati says, yes, each of you is correct. That is what I meant to say. All right, so with that, I'll just begin here. Page 141, the right-hand column. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the path to immortality. So Maitreyi, Yajnavalkya said to his wife one day, the time has come for me to go forth from the worldly life. Come, my dear, let me divide my property between you and Katyayani, my lord. She replied, if I could get all the wealth in the world, would that help me to go beyond death? Not at all. You would live and die like any other rich person. No one can buy immortality with money. So she's like, okay, then I'm not worried about money. I want to know about the way that leads to immortality. He says, oh, now I love you more than ever. So let's, sit down next to me and I'll explain this to you. So a wife loves her husband, not for his own sake, dear, but because the self with a capital S lives in him. Atman, that's Atman. A husband loves his wife, not because it's her, but because she's a manifestation of the self. Children love their parents. Wealth is loved by everyone. Brahmins are loved. Kshatriyas, the universe is loved. The gods are loved. Creatures, everything is loved, not for themselves, but because the self lives in them. Everything is loved, not for its own sake, but because the self lives in it. The self has to be realized. Hear about this self and meditate upon him, Maitreyi. When you hear about the self, meditate upon the self and finally realize the self. You come to understand everything in life. So everything's the self. All the castes, they are the self. As clouds of smoke arise from a fire laid with damp fuel, even so from the Supreme have issued forth all the Vedas, history, arts, sciences, poetry, aphorisms, and commentaries. All these are the breath of the Supreme. So the breath of the Supreme in other Vishnu-centric cosmology As I mentioned before, Mahavishnu exhales all of the universes, the bubble-like parallel universes, and then inhales them all again. Here comes the most famous image from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, right-hand column 142. As a lump of salt thrown in water dissolves and cannot be taken out again, though wherever we taste the water it is salty, even so, beloved, the separate self dissolves in the sea of pure consciousness, infinite and immortal. Separateness arises from identifying the self with the body, which is made up of the elements. The elements are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And then there's subtle elements, mind, intelligence, and false ego. So separateness arises from identifying the self with the body, which is made up of the elements. When this physical identification dissolves, there can be no more separate self. That is what I want to tell you, beloved. I am bewildered, blessed one, when you say there is then no separate self. And he says, reflect on what I have said, beloved, and you will not be confused. But when the self is realized as the indivisible unity of life, who can be seen by whom? Who can be heard by whom? Who can be smelled? Maitreyi, my beloved, how can the knower ever be known? So if there's only one self, as I mentioned before, you can't ever see your own eyes, because your eyes are the source of the field of vision. They're not contained in your field of vision. So how can there be no separate self? Well, there's only one self in whom everyone is united. And how can the knower ever be known? There's only one knower, Atman. How can it be known? We're all merged with Atman. So this is implying there's no separation that allows for personal relationships, and yet we're going to see some imagery that is exactly that, of two lovers embracing and forgetting everything else. All right, but that's what he said to Maitreyi. Now, King Janaka of Videha once performed a lavish sacrifice and distributed many gifts. So he drove 1,000 cows into a pen, and between the horns of each cow he fastened 10 gold coins. Then he said, Venerable Brahmins, these cows are for the wisest one among you. Let him take them away. None of the other Brahmins dared to speak, but Yajnavalkya said to his pupil Samashrava, Son, you can drive these cows home. Hero of seers, his pupil exclaimed joyfully, and he drove them home. So the other Brahmins were furious. How presumptuous, they shouted, and Ashvala, the royal priest, asked Yajnavalkya, do you really believe you are the wisest of those assembled here? Yajnavalkya replied, I salute the wisest, but I want those cows. All right, so he's like, 1,000 cows with 10,000 gold pieces. My disciple, hey son, you can take them on home right about now. What? So, how presumptuous. So now Vengargi, daughter of Vachukna, said, Venerable Brahmins, I shall ask Yajnavalkya only 2 questions. If he answers them well, no one here can defeat him in a spiritual debate. Ask, Gargi, the sage replied. So Gargi says, Yajnavalkya, as a warrior from Kashi or Videha rises with bow and arrow to fell his opponent, I rise to fell you with 2 questions. Ask them, Gargi. Okay, Gargi says, that which is above heaven and below the earth, which is also between heaven and earth, which is the same through past, present, and future. In what is that woven, warp, and woof? Tell me, Yajnavalkya. That which is above heaven and below earth, which is also between heaven and earth, that which is the same through the past, present, and future, that is woven, warp, and woof in space. So the word for space is a translation of akasha, which is the Sanskrit word that is often translated either space or ether. So the cosmology here is there's 5 material elements that are subtler and subtler as they expand outwards. So all the planets are in this hollow center of the universe, which is surrounded by 10 spheres of the basic elements. The earth element, then the water element, then the fire element, then the air element, and then the ether, akasha. And then some texts say there's 3 more super etheric spheres of mind, intelligence, and false ego, but here it's just the basic 5 that are being referred to, and the outermost is space. The past, the present, and the future are woven, warp, and woof in this outermost sphere. That I bring up again and again because that is what holographic string theory has told us. At the end of the 20th century, this divide between general relativity and quantum mechanics was resolved, at least mathematically, through holographic string theory, which I've talked about in previous videos, but this is what most academics in physics departments today believe. Stephen Hawking, one of its most famous proponents, Leonard Susskind, famous string theorist, defeated Stephen Hawking in the Black Hole War, and Stephen Hawking admitted defeat, and what Susskind said was that the information every bit of information that describes the past, the present, and the future of the universe is interwoven, smeared out at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, and then it radiates in on these fundamental threads of energy to create the holographic cinema that we experience as three-dimensional space enduring through time. Now, Gargi says, I have two questions, and if he can answer them, well, he must be the best. He's answered one. The past, present, and the future are interwoven in space, the akasha. Okay, so my first question is answered well. Now for my second question. Ask, Gargi, in what is space itself woven? Warp and woof. Tell me, Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya responds, the sages call it Akshara, the imperishable. It is neither big nor small, neither long nor short. It is without attachment. So he's describing it in a way that can be considered to be personal. In perfect accord with the will of the imperishable, sun and moon make their orbits, heaven and earth remain in place, moments, hours, days, nights, fortnights, months, everything, all the laws of the universe are according to the will of the imperishable Akshara, upon whom space is interwoven. And upon space, or the akasha, the past, the present, and the future are interwoven on the akasha, and the akasha is interwoven onto Akshara, the will of the universe. So without knowing the imperishable, Gargi, whoever performs rites and ceremonies, undergoes austerities, even for many years, reaps little benefit, because rites, ceremonies, and austerities are all perishable. Whosoever dies without knowing the imperishable dies in a pitiable state, but those who know the imperishable attain immortality when the body is shed at death. The imperishable is the seer, Gargi, though unseen, the hearer, though unheard, the thinker, though unthought, the knower, though unknown. Nothing other than the imperishable can see, hear, think, or know. It is in the imperishable that space is woven, warp and woof. Gargi says, Venerable Brahmins, count yourselves fortunate if you get away with merely paying this man homage. No one can defeat Yajnavalkya in debate about Brahman. All right, so this understanding of Akshara and the information describing the past, present, and future of the universe interwoven upon Akshara. And there was a part that was left out because this is skipping the Upanishads, it's skipping back. One I think that even more closely aligns the Brihadaranyaka with string theory, and that is, I will read here. Okay, so in the this is reading from my book here, Psyche and Singularity. So Udalaka Aruni asks Patanjala Kapya, do you know the string on which this world and the next, as well as all beings, are strung together? He then asks, do you know the inner controller of this world and the next, as well as of all beings, who controls them from within? Concluding, he says, if a man knows what that string is and who that inner controller is, he knows Brahman. He knows the worlds, he knows the gods, he knows the Vedas, he knows the spirits, he knows the self, he knows all. So this string upon which everything is interwoven. I'm going to read a little bit here from the Bhagavad Gita, which we're going to read later in our book, where Krishna, who says he's the supreme Vishnu, the supreme Atman, he also says, everything rests upon me as pearls are strung on a thread. I am the sound in ether and ability in man. I am the self, says Krishna. So this idea of information conservation at the outermost sphere, the akasha, which is personified in this imperishable entity called Akshara, who is this thread on whom everything is strung, is very similar to holographic string theory. And it does provide a conceptual way of believing in an eternal, individual, unchanging, and yet personal self, an individual self, because all of your personal memories and sense of individuality are conserved. They don't change. It appears as if things are changing, but all of that is projected from this information conservation at the outermost sphere, which is what the Upanishads is telling us here. In the Katha Upanishad, just to let you know, this isn't just an aberration, which is a near-death experience of a Brahmin boy named Nachiketa talking to the god of death, Yama. He says, like Maitreyi asked Jaggivalkya, I don't want wealth, I just want to know how to get immortality. So the same thing happened with Nachiketa asking Yama, who tempted him with wealth, I don't want that, give me knowledge of the eternal self. So then here's just something, actually this is the Taittiriya Upanishad, and and the Katha Upanishad, they talk about, so here's the Taittiriya Upanishad. He who knows Brahman, which is conscious, which is without end, as hidden in the depth of the heart, in the highest ether, he enjoys all blessings, at one with the omniscient Brahman. Okay, but the highest ether, this identification of the supreme truth with the highest outermost sphere of the universe is what I'm pointing to. In the Katha Upanishad, Yama talks about the senses are like the horses pulling the chariot of your body. Your soul is like the rider in the chariot. If you can get your senses under control, the horses will bring you to Vishnu at the outermost ether, where it says that, but he who has understanding for his charioteer and holds the reins of the mind, he reaches the end of his journey, and that is the highest place of Vishnu. Beyond the senses there are the objects, beyond the objects there is the mind, beyond the mind there is the intellect. The great self is beyond the intellect. So beyond the person there is nothing. That is the goal of the highest road. The Purusha, the highest goal of being, is the personal Vishnu. So that is the alternative to Shankara's interpretation, this atheistic interpretation, which Joel Kupperman was subscribing to. You can back it up with some of the things that you read right here in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And yet the alternative view is also available here. And that is what the commentators after Shankara said. It's like you're only picking out the ones that imply atheism. You're rejecting as metaphorical everything that implies a personal self. It's got both, so both are probably true. And that is, I think what most people think about an eternal, who I am, we have this intuitive sense that I am this person. I have a sense of myself with emotions and everything else. Now that might be all based on identification with the body, but does that mean that when the body dies, consciousness is all of it gone? Well, it's going to be brought up here in the Katha Upanishad. So let me just continue to read here. So Gargi beat all the other Brahmins by pointing out the relationship between past, the present, and the future, and Akshara, this thread, soul, on whom the past, the present, and the future is interwoven, who is the past and the present and the future. All right, so page 144, Jaggivalkya is continuing to teach Janaka. He says, the self indeed is the light of man, your majesty, for by that we sit, work, go out, and come back. Who is that self? The self. Pure awareness shines as the light within the heart, surrounded by the senses, only seeming to think, seeming to move. The self neither sleeps nor wakes nor dreams. But then he's going to go on to say that the self does dream, and then when the self dreams, the self enjoys all kinds of fantasies of its own creation. The human being has two states of consciousness, one in this world, the other in the next, but there's a third state between them, not unlike the world of dreams, in which we are aware of both worlds, with their sorrows and joys. When a person dies, it is only the physical body that dies. The person lives on in a non-physical body, which carries the impressions of his past life. It is these impressions that determine his next life. In this intermediate stage, he makes and dissolves impressions by the light of the self. So that third state between the two worlds reminds me of the horizon of the cosmos, where people say they go when they have these near-death experiences. And so there's some similarities. So I'll just bring that up and keep it moving, because I try to keep these videos no more than an hour and 20 minutes, because that's a regular class time. Okay, so in this third state of consciousness, there are no chariots, no horses drawing them, or roads on which to travel, but he, this is the self, makes up his own chariots, horses, and roads. In that state, there are no joys or pleasures, but he makes up his own joys and pleasures. He makes up his own lotus ponds, lakes, and rivers. It is he who makes up all these from the impressions of his past or waking life. So the implication here is there's only one self. When you die, the eternal, omnipresent, single self that was manifesting your little biography enjoys all these fantasies and brings all of the impressions accrued from your individual embodied life to the next body, where it starts over again. So it is said of these states of consciousness that in the dreaming state, when one is sleeping, the shining self, who never dreams, who is ever awake, watches by his own light the dreams woven out of past deeds and present desires. All right, the shining self never dreams, but Vishnu worshippers will say there is a form of Vishnu who dreams, Mahavishnu. This entire material cosmos is the dream of Vishnu. So the shining self keeps the body alive with the vital force of prana and wanders wherever it wills when you sleep. In the dreaming state, when one is sleeping, the shining self assumes many forms, eats with friends, indulges in sex, sees fearsome spectacles, sees good and evil, but then it returns to the state from which it began, where everything is one. There can be no good and evil if everything is one. As an eagle, wary after soaring in the sky, folds its wings and flies down to rest in its nest, so does the shining self enter the state of dreamless sleep, where one is freed from all desires. The self is free from desire, free from evil, free from fear. As a man in the arms of his beloved is not aware of what is without and what is within, so a person in union with the self is not aware of what is without and what is within. For in that unitive state, all desires find their perfect fulfillment. There is no other desire that needs to be fulfilled, and one goes beyond sorrow. So that metaphor implies that the individual soul unites with the Supreme Self, not by obliterating individual personality, but by embracing the Supreme Personality in an act of love. When two lovers embrace, they become one, and they're oblivious to everything else around them, but they're still two people. So that it's things like that the atheistic interpretation of Hinduism, they'll dismiss that as, well, it's just poetic metaphor, but it's really ultimately impersonal, Brahman. Okay, so continuing here on page 145, the left-hand column, but where there is unity, one without a second, that is the world of Brahman. This is the supreme goal of life, the supreme treasure, the supreme joy. Those who do not seek this supreme goal live on but a fraction of this joy. I give you another 1,000 cows, says Janaka. Please teach me more of the way to self-realization. As a heavily laden cart creaks as it moves along, the body groans under its burden when a person is about to die. When the body grows weak through old age or illness, the self separates himself as a mango or fig or banyan fruit frees itself from the stalk and returns the way he came to begin another life. Another image is a caterpillar, an inchworm. When it's getting ready to die, it pulls itself together and then it reaches back out to the next leaf, bringing with it its consciousness from the past life, or like an old piece of jewelry is melted down and created into a new piece of jewelry. So they're talking about reincarnation. So he makes for himself a new, more beautiful shape, like that of the devas or other celestial beings. The self is indeed Brahman, but through ignorance people identify it with intellect, mind, senses, passions, and the elements of earth, water, air, space, and fire. This is why the self is said to consist of this and that, and appears to be everything. But we saw earlier that the self, the elements, earth, water, air, space, and fire. Space is akasha, that's the outermost sphere, and that's where the past, the present, and the future are interwoven, and that space, or akasha, is interwoven on Akshara, which seems to be the akasha personified, this immortal will of the universe. He'll then go on to say, this is Jagyavalkya, as a person acts, so he becomes in life. You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. So this deep driving desire that you form in this life, that will determine what you become in your next life. So you should develop the deep abiding desire to realize the self. That's the ultimate goal. As the skin of a snake is sloughed off onto an anthill, so does the mortal body fall. But the self, freed from the body, merges in Brahman, infinite light. Infinite life, eternal light. I give you another 1,000 cows, says Janaka. So those who realize the self enter into the peace that brings complete self-control and perfect patience. They see themselves in everyone and everyone in themselves. Okay, so that's not disavowing the existence of individual selves. It's saying, I see all of you, all different people. I'm in you and you're in me. What's that Beatles song? I am you and you are me and we are all together. See how they run. All right, I forget what that's, at any rate, you know, we might all be one, but at the same time we're different. That could be interpreted from what Yajnavalkya was saying here. And now the final chapter is just a couple of images here. The children of Prajapati, the creator, gods, human beings, and asuras, the godless, so the demons. So Prajapati made demigods, humans, and demons. They lived with their father as students. When they had completed the allotted period, the gods said, "Venerable one, please teach us." Prajapati answered with one syllable, "Da." "Have you understood?" he asked. "Yes," they said. "You have told us, Damyata, be self-controlled." Right, so the demigods interpreted da to mean damyata, be self-controlled, because the demigods have a proclivity towards hedonism. They live on these planets where they engage in celestial enjoyments. So they're thinking, oh, we have to control our sense desires. And then Prajapati said, "Yes, you have understood." Then the human being is approached. "Venerable one, please teach us." Prajapati answered with one syllable, "Da." "Have you understood?" he asked. "Yes," they said. "You have told us, data, give." So I guess the humans are considered to be kind of greedy. So they're thinking, oh, you're telling us we need to be more generous, give. And Prajapati said, "You have understood." Then the godless, the demons, the asuras approached. "Venerable one, please teach us." Prajapati answered with the same syllable, da. "Have you understood?" he asked. "Yes," they said. "You have told us, dayad vam, be compassionate." So the demons are kind of sadistic and they torture people. So they're thinking, oh, we need to compensate by being compassionate. "You have understood," he said. The heavenly voice of the thunder repeats this teaching. Da, da, da. Be self-controlled, give, be compassionate. It's also another song. A do, 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 a da, da, da. That's all I want to say to you. Okay, so that's 1 hour and 22 minutes. We have covered in this video, for exam 3, part B, we have begun to address this, which is explain the differences between Hindu and Buddhist views of the self. And for part A, which of the views on the self do you think presents the best argument? So in the next video, we'll be going over Buddhism and David Hume.